Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hearts of Iron 4 video. Oh my god, we have another visitor. Hello Moonbeam. Obligatory like for my cat that demands attention every single time I'm about to start a video. Yes, listen to those purrs. By this point, you all know how it is that it works in this channel. I take the top 4 most liked comments offering suggestions off of the alternate history videos, I put that into a poll, and then you all get to vote on what the next video is going to be. In this case, the answer seems clear. What if Italy failed in Ethiopia and Mussolini is deposed? Well, oh my god, you have no idea just how many things that is going to change. The story of World War II and the fascists is something that is extremely unlikely, and as I've explained before about the rise of Germany, specifically the rise of Mr. Mustache Man, a lot of dumb luck happened for them that really put things in their favor. One of the key things for Germany is that the dream team between the Reich and the Italian fascists under Mussolini, this wasn't necessarily always something that was going to happen. I'll explain in more detail about that in a bit, but the reality is that Mussolini was one of the key driving forces behind Mustache Man in the first place, and it's really only thanks to him being the guy that is in power that that alliance even happened in the first place. At the same time that I say that, in order to get Mussolini out of power, it's not like we can simply say, oh, well, back in the 20s, which, yes, Mussolini rose to power in the 1920s, it's not like we can say that he just never rises to power, though a lot more could happen in order to make that possible. Instead, we are working with the whole Italo-Ethiopian War, the second Italo-Abyssinian War, which honestly, I could go and play the game as Ethiopia in order to potentially demonstrate this, but it's really easier to show precisely what would happen while playing as Italy, because technically speaking, victory was not guaranteed in this conflict, but simultaneously it was extremely likely by the point that this game takes place in 1936. But hey, speaking of things that go boom, how about you make things go boom yourself with today's sponsor, War Thunder. Yeah, you see what we did there? My friends, I absolutely love War Thunder. It is easily the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. This is a game in which you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from little biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s, all the way to modern fighter jets and main battle tanks. With absolutely intense combat, incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects, this is something that puts you right in the midst of some of the most powerful war machines that have ever existed. When you go and sign up, you join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles. With so much content left to discover in the game, there is really nothing that is better suited for fans of military history, especially for the people who watch things on this channel. This is something that probably appeals to you, I'm guessing. Just as a heads up, this is also something that different people within my community will play in the Discord. This is something that we have fun regularly doing. And so if you go click the links down in my description, whether you are a new or returning player, whether you play on PC or on console, you can get access to a massive bonus pack. This bonus pack will give you multiple premium vehicles as well as an exclusive vehicle decorator, the Eagle of Valor, along with 100,000 Silver Lions, as well as 7 days of premium account. Play War Thunder using my link, and I will see you all here on the battlefield. In fact, it's kind of funny, but this whole second war that Italy launched against Ethiopia after they lost the first one decades ago didn't necessarily have to happen, but for Mussolini, it absolutely did, because the loss to Ethiopia in the first Italo-Abyssinian War was a huge stain on Italy's honor. It was the colonial state that failed multiple times to get more colonies. In fact, during that time period, there was a huge embarrassment dealing with China here as well, but that's a whole other story in and of itself. Of course, Italy historically went and won this conflict, because Ethiopia, though it was fiercely defended and did at a number of different points outnumber the Italians, simultaneously they were incredibly backwards. The weapons that they were utilizing were quite literally centuries old in some cases, down to muskets, while others were equipped with modern rifles. It was a varied force, and it was something that, considering how the state was structured and what it did, there's very little chance that Ethiopia would actually win the conflict. In fact, one of the key things that happened is that when Italy initially launched the war back in the, October, I think, of 1935, they proceeded south from Eritrea up here with around 200,000 men. But the commander who was leading them at the time was incredibly slow and cautious. This is something that frustrated Mussolini, who had him replaced, and a more general advance would take place until it is that the Ethiopians would launch the Christmas offensive, which if I tag switch over to Ethiopia right now, you can see that for a temporary time, they get an additional 10% attack and breakthrough against the Italians because the Ethiopians, in a massive counter-push, had pushed back the Italians despite the odds. Of course, this was not going to last forever, and soon Mussolini really put the boot down. And by the boot, I mean copious amounts of mustard gas amongst many other chemical substances that were dropped upon the Ethiopians by plane. The amount of war crimes that would take place during this period was, a lot. In fact, this was something that was so bad that it was actually the actions of Italy in Ethiopia that was one of the key things that ended up turning the Allies, specifically like the UK, against working with Italy in order to be able to counter the German Reich. Prior to this, there was a whole idea of the Stresa Front, which if I go over here into the national focuses, there it is, ratify the Stresa Front. This is something that would be an effort to try and surround and contain Germany to stop any aggressive expansion. Italy had been in negotiation with the Allies for years prior to this and was kind of playing both sides off of each other. But ultimately, the diplomatic isolation that they would face after their actions in Ethiopia would pretty much cement their alliance with the Germans. So then, what happens in this new timeline then, and why? Well, first off, from the very get-go, even though we would go ahead and put all of our forces here potentially into an army in order to be able to deal with the Ethiopians, we are actually not going to do that right now. Now, the guy who was initially in charge of the offense here was Emilio De Bono, but he was replaced by Mussolini for Pietro Pariglio. So, from the very get-go, we're going to go ahead and put him in charge, and then essentially replacing caution with more aggression. Unlike what we would probably do in a natural game where we would take the Italian forces that already exist in Italy and then just ship them down south in order to be able to try and finish off this war as soon as possible, we are not going to be doing that here. We're going to say probably in this timeline that the Italians underestimated the Ethiopians even more. Perhaps in the beginning, instead of sending 200,000 men, they sent 150,000 or 175,000. Basically, they sent less, and then the Ethiopians were either more competent or more lucky. The Christmas offensive did more, and that the leadership of the Italians were even somehow more incompetent than they were in our own timeline. At the same time, even though the Italians would have air superiority and would be able to utilize chemical weapons, we will actually say in this time that they don't specifically utilize those weapons because they don't want to potentially isolate the Western powers and others that would look down upon them for using them. From that, no focus on war logistics is properly done. Instead, the Italians are focusing more on home developments in this new time, while the forces in the south struggle against the Ethiopians. And so with the setup complete, let's go ahead and begin, my friends. With the end of the Christmas offensive, we are presented with an option. Our troops have stolen the war against Abyssinia and have been pushed back in certain places. This Christmas offensive has Mussolini privately berating the military high command and for their incompetencies. The Duce wants results now. He has therefore authorized any means necessary to repel the Abyssinians and to end the war swiftly, whatever it takes. Which, historically, by any means necessary, means a copious amount of, well, chemical weapons, among other things. As I said before, what we're going to be doing instead is a more methodical and deliberate attack. This is something where lives are not going to be wasted needlessly, and one also needs to understand that the expenses that were incurred with the occupation and, well, initial takeover of Ethiopia were massive. The colonial efforts that they launched down here were not profitable by any means, and instead, in the long term, ended up proving to be a massive drain on the Italian economy. Something that it really couldn't afford, considering that it needed to modernize and industrialize itself. To that end, the only real positive effect that will happen here within Ethiopia is that the whole thing will serve as a valuable learning experience for the Italian troops. The other thing that we can arguably say is that Italy during this time is not going to focus necessarily as much effort into their military arm, at least not yet. The big thing that Italy was trying to do was to modernize its state, and we're going to say that perhaps this was something that would be more successful as potentially less resources are wasted down south. Historically, by spring of 1936, the Italians had conquered all the way into Addis Ababa. In our case, though, that's not happening. In fact, we're going to say that everything in here ends horribly, that for whatever reason, again, due to better leadership on the Ethiopians' part, more Italian incompetence, or more, that things just go absolutely horribly for them. To the point that, by some miracle, Ethiopia actually wins the conflict, driving the Italians back into a corner and forcing a general withdrawal. It is, in turn, a massive fiasco, and a change in leadership is something that is necessary. Our generous offer of peace has been accepted by the Abyssinians. This is far from the glorious victory we imagined at the outset of the war, but perhaps we can take comfort in the fact that the war is now over. We will overcome this humiliation like we have done so many times before, and we will rise up stronger than ever. With this, a white peace is established with Ethiopia, and in general, we're going to say that nothing necessarily changes. The general withdrawal that we're talking about is not that the Ethiopians drive the Italians back to the ocean, right? We're not going to necessarily say that. That would be kind of ridiculous to assume. A lot more things would need to happen in Ethiopia way earlier in order to make that timeline possible. However, the Italians still managed to at least keep a hold of their Eritrean and Somali colonies. For Mussolini, this whole thing is a massive embarrassment, which in turn, just as he predicted with his generals plotting against him and other politicians, it is going to gear the national balance of power further towards the Grand Council of Fascism and away from Mussolini's more autocratic Il Duce mannerisms. With that, we will convene the Grand Council. We must convene the Grand Council of Fascism to discuss what to do about Mussolini. His latest foray into Ethiopia and unwillingness to share power or responsibility has left many questioning his capabilities as a leader. He has served the country well and is the very face of fascism, but it might be time for new leadership. Which, yes, for anyone who is unaware, Mussolini, the Italian fascist, is the guy who started fascism. He's actually the person that Mustache Man would take great inspiration from in order to establish his own political movement. So Mussolini was the OG, quite literally. As for what exactly is going to happen politically during this time period, it's going to be quite a bit. The national balance of power is going to gradually shift towards the Council of Fascism as Il Duce is sidelined. Mussolini is going to be questioned, he's going to be slandered, the army is going to gradually turn away from him, because really the big thing for the Italian public during this time is that a lot of them supported Mussolini because he was the strongman who was saving Italy and modernizing it. His efforts in Ethiopia, if they had failed, would have been a catastrophic blow for himself as well as fascism. Less so necessarily for fascism, depending upon how bad the loss is, but definitely for the image of Mussolini, this is not something that he would likely be able to recover from. As a result, it wouldn't be an immediate change, but you could guarantee that before the year is out in 1936, Mussolini would not be in charge anymore. So it is then, in mid-1936, that Mussolini would get deposed. The time has come to oust Mussolini from power. He has proven himself to be an incompetent leader that has dragged our beloved Italy through many unnecessary hardship and tested its resilience well past the breaking point. While his shadow might loom large over us for some time to come, Italy and its people will prevail. Of course, there is still a major event that is going to take place in this time, and this is where we're actually going to see another major shift: the Spanish Civil War. See, historically, the biggest supporters of nationalist Spain in this time was the fascist Italians. However, in this new timeline, that is probably not going to happen. Yes, some volunteers are likely to still be sent over. The German Reich is also going to send over volunteers in the case of the Condor Legion. However, nationalist Spain is going to get significantly less support in this time because even though the Italians will arguably have greater resources from not wasting them down in Ethiopia, the loss in Ethiopia would leave such a poor taste within the government's mouth that there wouldn't really be the ability to justify sending as much as they did in our own time. Perhaps Il Duce would want to do this in order to be able to shore up his own political power and show Italian might. However, it is unlikely that his advisors or other people in the government would allow him to do so. So instead of the hundreds of thousands of guns that the Italians sent in our own time, volunteers are still sent, but the Spanish nationalists are not going to get nearly as much as they did. Either way, though, Mussolini is deposed, the Grand Council of Fascism established, and this is what brings up a very important question of what exactly is going to happen after. There are two primary candidates that we're going to have that are going to take things over: either Italo Balbo or Dino Grande. Now, in my opinion, the most likely person to take over in the situation is Italo Balbo, because what the fascists are going to be looking for at this time is an actual military man who's going to be able to solidify Italy's stances in order to be able to build up its military image, which is something that gives the fascists power in the first place. The likelihood of Italy breaking out into civil war and turning into a communist state or a democratic state or something after this is unlikely. The fascists have controlled things for decades now, or at least over a decade. And as such, their grip on power is actually quite strong. Yes, Mussolini is going to be weakened, but other Italian fascists are going to be able to potentially fill that gap, especially if they're able to then focus on things at home versus wasted colonial efforts. So, Italo Balbo. We need a capable military leader to guide us through the turbulent times that lie ahead. Italo Balbo is not only a military leader, he is also an aviation hero that has undertaken several diplomatic missions and has governed our Libyan possessions quite effectively. Surely, he will improve the meager state of our military it is in and bring glory to Italy. Not only does he become an aviation hero, which is actually quite awesome, this is something where he himself would have quite a bit of support among both the varying different fascist politicians, but also amongst the everyday average people. And I mean, hey, just look at that beard. Looks nice, doesn't it? Either way, it brings up then a very important question of what is going to be happening next. Is Italy going to focus more on its economy? Is it going to build back up its military? Is it going to launch into foreign affairs? Well, that's going to entirely depend upon the circumstances that the world turns to. The reality is that Italy is likely to focus more internally in this time. From losing down south and not wanting to engage in many colonial ambitions, the squandering is going to stop. For too long, Mussolini has been spending money and resources Italy can ill afford. It is time to put an end to these reckless squanderings. We need to rein in our expenses and focus our capital on improving other areas. However, there is a place where Italy is likely to see their amount of support increase, and that is Austria. The federal state of Austria seeks our support. The federal state of Austria has sent the general and from time to time military attaché, Emil Levitsky, to us with a request for aid. He and others within the Austrian leadership have seen worrying tendencies from the German Reich, and they now wish to have a more formalized support from us in the event that their assessments of the situation are in fact correct. As parties that signed the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, we are likely expected to come to their aid, although loopholes in the text can likely be found. This is easily the most important distinction that we need to make here, and you all need to understand what happened historically. As I said from the very get-go, Italy never had to necessarily ally with Germany, and for a large part of the early, 30s, they were specifically against Germany. It was the Italian efforts down in Ethiopia and the diplomatic isolation that they faced, the abandonment of the Stresa Front, that pushed the Italians to reconcile with the Germans and actually side with them. Because for the longest time, Italy supported Austria specifically to defend it against Germany. It was only after everything that they faced that they basically gave Austria up and allowed the Anschluss to happen. With Italian resources likely not being wasted nearly to the same degree that they were in Spain, and also at the same time not being wasted down here in Ethiopia, that means that, well, the Austrians are going to see subsidies. They're going to see greater influence. Italian fascist efforts that are going to try to limit the, effects of the German Nazi Party that had been trying to stage coups in Austria for years. Thus, their independence is of utmost importance to us. At the same time that is happening, one needs to understand that a change in leadership is going to have a lot of consequences. As such, consolidating power is an absolute necessity. Our grip on the party and the country at large remains weak. We must consolidate what power we have and bolster our regime by showing the public that we are as strong and dependable as ever before. Eventually, through a variety of efforts, a balance of power is likely achieved with Balbo versus the Council of Fascism. Balbo is still going to be a part of things, and he is going to be seen as the leader. However, they're probably not going to have nearly as much support for a figure like Il Duce as they did previously in our own timeline. Now here, my friends, is a very interesting thing, the Anti-Comintern Pact, and this is where we're also going to end up differing a little bit in history. Historically, what had happened is that Italy did join the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1937, even though they had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that had been in place since 1933. The whole reason why they would even do so is because Mussolini was very friendly to Germany. At that point, at least. Something that in this new timeline is not going to be happening, and as such, it would make sense that, in fact, the Italians refuse to join the Anti-Comintern Pact. As for what that actually does to Italo-German relations, well, we can say it's certainly not going to be great. Once this is done, once power is consolidated, it is here that a massive effort would be put in place at home, that instead of diverting resources overseas, mass militarization, industrialization, everything would be put into place specifically on the Italian mainland. Of course, even though the nationalists are not going to get supported to nearly the same degree that they were in our own time, it doesn't mean that things are necessarily going to be easy for the Republicans. I mean, after all, the anarchists, the Stalinists, all the varying different forces that were dividing the Republican side, they're still going to have this exact same issue. As the middle to late 1937 rolls around, it is here that Italy would likely have to begin to reframe itself foreign policy-wise. After all, unlike what happened in our own timeline, the Italians would not be aligning themselves with the Germans. They would be more partial to, both the French and specifically the British in this new timeline. Relations would sought to be maintained and even improved in this point. The question of the Balkans, though, that becomes its entire other issue. Balbo, of course, is going to want to show off Italian strength, but simultaneously there's going to be a lot more internal focuses and developments. As such, the idea of taking over the Balkans is unlikely. Instead, potential allies would be sought in the Balkans. Influence is going to be sought in order to maintain Italy as a kind of hegemon, but not necessarily the aggressive attacker that Mussolini was. In order to control the Balkans, we do not need to subjugate and dominate all the nations in the region. It is time to use diplomacy to secure beneficial allies in the Balkans, and then subjugate the rest. The federal state of Austria breaks the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Without any warning whatsoever, we've been informed that the federal state of Austria will no longer abide by the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, with all that entails. Most importantly, this means they will now rearm freely with no regard to the limitations that was set upon them after the Great War. Why they suddenly so wish to rearm remains unclear. Well, yeah, fine, let them. Don't know why that would actually be an issue for us here. So it is then, my friends, in 1938 that the biggest decision of all is made in here. Instead of going with the Pact of Steel as what historically would happen in, say, 1939, what instead is going to happen is that Austrian independence is going to be guaranteed. We cannot tolerate German interference in Austria as it represents a great threat to the Italian nation and the balance of power in Europe. We will guarantee the independence of Austria and we will oppose any diplomatic maneuvers that Germany intends to use to influence the country. In the event that Germany attempts to do the Anschluss, Italy will get an option to intervene. So it is, my friends, in middle of 1938 that this is where everything hits the fan. Germany attempts to Anschluss Austria. The vile German state is attempting to interfere in Austrian politics and absorb the country into their own. We have earlier issued guarantees to them, and as such, our population expects us to stand up to the Germans for them. We might be able to ask the British and French for assistance. What should we do? Well, here's the thing. If everything has been playing out precisely as we have been describing, then it means that Italy in this time is significantly more friendly to the West, to the allies of Britain and France. An effort has been made, maybe even secretly, to specifically contain the Germans. And unlike what had happened in the Sudetenland crisis, in which the German saboteur elements within the military specifically tried to give plans to Britain and tell them, hey guys, please don't let the mustache man actually do this, stop him and we will rise up against him, they didn't listen that time. In this case, though, with Italian negotiations actually working and a new person, not Mussolini in charge, that means that they're more likely to listen. Italy is way less diplomatically isolated in this time. We can take them oh my god, okay, see, that's funny, plus 15% war support, cool. Yeah, no, we are still going to ask for help. Yep, there goes the German state declaring war on the federal state of Austria. What is likely to happen in that time is that Germany is still going to proceed forward with some kind of action plan. Is it going to be a full-on invasion? Maybe not necessarily, but certainly there will be German volunteer elements in a coup that are going to try and take over the state, which in turn is going to lead to a very bloody war. This is going to be the start of World War II, except perhaps maybe the Allies are not fully prepared to jump into things just yet. The French state guarantees Austrian independence. The French have, as per the Italian request, decided to back the Austrians in their fight for independence and promise to attack any potential aggressors that may try to intervene in the nation's sovereignty. Though the Germans are likely to make some gains here in the beginning, with Italian forces flooding into the region and able to protect the very strong mountainous points in Austria, this is not something that is going to, well, allow them to be able to move in easily. With enough Italian troops who are experienced in fighting in the Alps, this will actually be a very effective defense. Of course, the German military industry is likely to be vastly superior at this point, so this means that the Italian Air Force is going to get completely and utterly eviscerated. It is going to do its best in order to try and defend against things, but it is going to be hard-pressed to provide any meaningful defense, meaning Italy is not going to have the advantage to be able to push like it would potentially if it did. Now, despite the claims that, of course, France and Britain and more would back the Italians in this effort, they most certainly were not ready. The entire purpose of the appeasement strategy in the first place was specifically meant to delay things. So aid that could potentially be given to the Italians, additional guns, additional planes, additional everything, this is likely to occur in this timeline. However, the Italians would essentially be the punching bag of the Germans for the longest time in this brutal combat that would take place in the Alps. However, as the Italians fight more and more and demand more resources, it is possible that they would have a stronger position on the negotiation table, and they could negotiate Italian claims. Our opposition to Germany has put us in position to power over the former Entente nations, who are desperately seeking a break between the Italian and German regimes. We must exploit this situation and our advantage and reclaim the colonial possessions that were denied us after the Great War. This, in a sense, would be basically the new phony war, if you will. Until eventually, if the Italians are able to hold out the Germans, if they're able to dig in for a defensive position well into 1939, then maybe the Stresa Front is actually able to be ratified, and from there, the Entente is able to fully join in. Territorial concessions have now been granted to Italy, so it is time to start the process that will bring Italy and France into the military alliance called the Stresa Front. So it is then that by July or August of 1939, a time in which World War II would actually start with the invasion of Poland, instead, both Britain and France, after a year of preparation or more, would finally be able to join in and help the Italians, having mobilized their forces and prepared for offensive maneuvers into Germany. What one needs to understand here at this point is that the German Reich is not going to be able to hope to stand up against this. In fact, there's a decent chance that if the Germans had been stopped specifically in Austria, that the failure of that would have led to an internal coup within Germany in the first place. One also needs to remember that the German army was significantly smaller in 1938 and 1939 than it would have been in our own time. Even if the military had actually stayed loyal to the Führer, the likelihood of that military then being able to succeed when it barely had the ammunition to be able to sustain any kind of real conflict would be laughable at best, to be honest. One of the other fascinating things to note here during this time is that the Winter War is still likely to occur at this point, even if it is only in a sense that the Soviets are likely to engage in some kind of border skirmish, because even without the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact being in place, or perhaps it still does take place here at this time, the Soviets are able to have basically free reign because the West is occupied with Germany, meaning the Soviets are still likely to take over Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and even put pressure upon Poland. As the German army quite literally runs out of fuel and ammunition, their front lines would collapse. Civil strife, internal coups, much more is likely to happen, which in turn would mean that the Reich itself would begin to gradually fall apart. Eventually, by the end of 1939, potentially the beginning of 1940, Germany itself would collapse, beaten by the Italians, though, to be fair, it's not necessarily the Italians that would beat them, more so their own incompetence and, well, eagerness to get into conflict. Mustache Man was not exactly the best long-term planner. As for what the end result is going to be, that is really something that leaves to be questioned. Naturally, Austria is likely to get something out of the conflict. As for how much, who can really say? Perhaps southern Germany is carved off and put into their sphere of influence. France would, of course, take the territory around Luxembourg and Alsace-Lorraine, further creating a greater buffer for itself, and though this territory would not likely be a permanent occupation, a puppet state would likely be set up along the Rhine in order to be able to serve as a greater buffer against German aggression. The British, for their part, would likely take over the greatest share of occupation, along with the Italians. The northwestern territories of Germany would be seized and administered under a separate government, and likely, considering all the conflict and escalations that had been taking place between the Germans and the Poles, the British would end up taking over both Hinterpalm as well as Erlen-Mosren in order to be able to make sure that Danzig was secure. The rest of the territory would likely be put under Italian administration, even if only to be able to gain back the funds that had been spent in order to be able to protect Austria in the first place. From this, my friends, Germany is unlikely to exist at all afterwards. Though I say that, that's not necessarily the case in the event that the German Reich collapses significantly faster because of internal coups that, again, are almost guaranteed to take place because of German failures in Austria. That means that different elements within the Nazi government are likely to reach out to the British, to the Italians, to others to gain legitimacy in establishing their own government, and that is what is going to end up negotiating with the varying Allied powers. What this means afterwards, though, who can really say? Poland is, after all, still going to exist. The Balkans are going to be secure. The great threat at this point for Europe would likely then be the Soviets. However, after Stalin would see Germany get utterly eradicated, there would be no point in trying to engage in further aggression. Any Baltic territory that had not been taken already would likely be ignored or put under communist influence with varying different agents sent in. No aggressive action would be taking place, specifically because they would not really be in any position to do so, not potentially for at least the next 5 to 10 years. As for the Japanese, they were still going to do their thing over here in, well, China. However, they're not going to be engaging in the Southern strategy in order to be able to take out the Netherlands for the Dutch East Indies, nor will they be attacking Pearl Harbor, because to do so would be tantamount to suicide at this point, as the West would be now stronger than ever. With that, my friends, the war ends. 1939, 1940, millions upon millions of less people die, and Europe is significantly more secure. If only, and I say this not as an unlikely scenario, if only the Italians had lost in Ethiopia and Mussolini been deposed, then maybe things would not have happened as they did in our own time. With that, my friends, we're going to go ahead and end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate all of you. Let me know in the comment section below what kind of scenario you'd like to see next. This was actually a very quick one to make, and it was a fun and fascinating one, really. Like, this is not something that I'm making up. This is a genuine reality that could have happened. But yeah, once again, I guess that is the end of that here today, my friends. And if you want more military chaos, then make sure to check out the sponsor of today's video, War Thunder.